Well, everybody, thanks for coming this afternoon for our OHA forum with Trustee Keliʻi Akina. We did invite his opponent, Lei Ahu Isa. Unfortunately, she declined to participate today, so we'll just be talking to Keliʻi today. Just some housekeeping things before we start. If you do have a question for Keliʻi, we've got some note cards in the back. You can write your question, and one of the Civil Beat employees will run it up to me. Don't try to shout it out because we are recording this so that people can go back later and listen. And if you do that, the mic's not going to pick it up. I know I just went over that, even though we got a small crowd, but that's okay. We've got to repeat it every time. So yeah, we'll just get into it. Keliʻi, my first question is: when you first ran for OHA, you opposed the development of a Hawaiian nation in part because it was race-based, OHA's involvement in that. You're now a trustee for OHA. It's a branch of government created specifically to benefit Hawaiians. I think at the surface, some people might look at that and think that those two views appear to be in conflict. How do you reconcile that?
Well, Blaze, I'll be glad to respond to that. And first, however, thanks for having me on board over here. I appreciate being down here at Civil Beat, such a great organization. And I thank you for giving some attention to the OHA race. And it's good to see you after knowing you from a distance for many, many years. But I'm Keliʻi Akina, and I'm honored to be a trustee at large at the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. And you asked me an important question about my motivation for running for office. And I'd like to get to that and share that a little later on. But with respect to Hawaiian sovereignty, I wasn't opposed to Hawaiian sovereignty. I believe, in fact, that it's the constitutional right of all people to seek redress from their government. And that's the foundation in the Declaration of Independence, that people need to hold their governments accountable and, in one phrase of the Declaration of Independence, actually be able to change government if necessary. So I don't have any problem for advocating for Hawaiian sovereignty. One thing we've got to clarify is that Hawaiian sovereignty means many different things to different people. And sovereignty runs the gamut in definitions from corporate forms of sovereignty akin to perhaps a monarchy and so forth, separation from the United States, it could include, to the other end of the spectrum of living within the structure of the United States and identifying as a true lahui, a true nation, not in a political sense. So I just wanted to clarify, I've never been opposed to sovereignty of anyone. In fact, I believe that we all need to be sovereign, especially at an individual level. We all have to be autonomous. We all have to defend the freedom of each other. You may be referring to the fact that I did oppose one specific attempt to create a structure that most Hawaiians really didn't want. It was a type of enrollment of Hawaiians as part of a nation, but many Hawaiians found their names on that roll without their permission. Many Hawaiians found that when they applied, they needed to sign a document that they didn't agree with. And there were problems like that. Of course, it required being a Hawaiian by blood. But people came to me and said, this isn't a Pono thing. It's not a good thing. It's not letting us be self-determining. So fundamentally, I opposed something that called itself a sovereignty movement that wasn't actually promoting the sovereignty of the individuals and the people that it was trying to represent.
Do you see OHA engaging in a process like that in the near future? Maybe not in the same way it was in 2015, 2016, when all that was going on, but what do you think will happen with that, and where do you think OHA will fall on the sovereignty issue?
Well, Blaze, OHA, according to the Hawaii Revised Statutes, exists for the betterment of the conditions of the Native Hawaiians. And it's also the agency that heads up the development of Hawaiians into what we call ea or a lahui. But there's no specific definition of that. So OHA has not said it's going to be a certain form of government. OHA has not said it's going to be separated from the United States. In my personal view, I think OHA needs to take seriously its first charge, and that is to improve the conditions of the Native Hawaiian. What we're talking about here is the ability to have homes, the ability to earn a living in this economy, the ability to have health care, and so forth. At the heart of OHA's current 15-year strategic plan, which is called Mana, it has two key words in it: Mana, power.
Mana I Mauliola.
Yeah, Mana I Mauliola, and Ola, life. At the heart of it is health and well-being, and that leads to the blossoming of the Hawaiian nation. That's where OHA needs to put its attention, meeting the needs of Hawaiians. But then when it comes to empowering sovereignty, OHA can convene Hawaiians and their various views of sovereignty, but OHA isn't charged with championing any one form. And so OHA is more of a resource to help Hawaiians to thrive, as well as to understand what kind of sovereignty they want.
You're talking about improving the condition of Native Hawaiians, and you mentioned things like housing, improving healthcare. But OHA is not a development agency, nor are they, an agency that specifically looks at a lot of the things they're kind of meant to improve. I mean, how exactly do you improve housing if you're not a housing development agency? We'll just tackle that first.
The important thing is to have the end in mind. OHA doesn't operate on the ground level. It's not an agency that actually builds brick and mortar houses and so forth. OHA operates on a policy and resource level. And that's very important to getting housing. So what OHA is committed to doing is raising the financial resources that are necessary to empower Hawaiians, and OHA distributes that wealth. One of the ways we do it currently is through a grants program. Millions of dollars a year are given to organizations that serve the Native Hawaiian population in the very things you were talking about. They're on the ground level, helping with housing, with health, with employment issues, and so forth. And the role that OHA plays is amassing the financial resources that are necessary and empowering these organizations to serve Hawaiians. So it's a real wonderful reciprocal relationship. And a lot of the work that trustees do is supervising a process of identifying various organizations through whom to distribute the funds.
I want to come back to the money and the grants in a little bit, but I do want to ask you your thoughts on one thing. It seems like in the public eye, OHA often flies under the radar, kind of. What do you think that is, and what do you think OHA should be doing about it?
Well, Blaze, a lot of people just don't know what OHA is. And so that lack of awareness results in, as you say, OHA flying under the radar, and ultimately people not getting involved in the OHA election. Many people aren't aware that they themselves, as citizens of the state of Hawaii, have a right and a responsibility to vote in OHA elections. So that's one of the reasons. But I think the awareness is becoming greater now. I think that more and more people are aware of the impact of OHA, especially since it has grown significantly in the last 20 years and is involved in significant land ownership, issues that affect culture, such as weighing in on the 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea. It's looked to for leadership by Native Hawaiians, as well as culturally by all people in the state, for a sense of Hawaiian leadership. So I think that's changing in terms of OHA's recognition in the community.
Do you think OHA is doing enough to act as a check on the other branches of government, and where do you think it could be doing better?
Well, when you say check on the other branches of government, you're probably talking about advocacy for Native Hawaiians, because that's the particular role that OHA plays. And OHA has a specific role given to it by the Hawaii Revised Statutes, in which it is to advocate for Hawaiian interests within every agency in government. So that gives OHA a lot of standing. I mean, it's not anybody who can just go up to the Department of Land and Natural Resources and say, hey, we got to talk about this. You need to fix this, and so forth. But that's part of the mandate of OHA on behalf of Native Hawaiians. So OHA, it becomes relevant then to the rest of government. But when you say, is OHA a check, I'd have to say, theoretically, it should be a check on the rest of the government if the rest of the government is not doing what it should do for Native Hawaiians. And one area in particular where that might be a very big thing is the distribution of the revenues from the ceded lands. You see, when the federal government acquired the Hawaiian Islands, it kept 1.8 million acres approximately in trust and reserve to be given eventually to the state of Hawaii at statehood. So part of the Statehood Act is an agreement between the federal government, the new state of Hawaii, and the people of Hawaii, that 1.8 million acres of land would go to Hawaii from the federal government, which it was Hawaii's land. It was owned by the Hawaiian people, the royalty of Hawaii. Now, this land generates revenues, and OHA, on behalf of the Hawaiian people, is entitled to 20% of the revenues. This land also includes undersea land that is in our harbors, for example. In terms of keeping a check on the rest of the government, OHA has the duty and responsibility to make sure that the rest of the government is actually providing to the Hawaiians that 20% pro rata portion of the ceded lands revenues. And this is a very important check and balance role for OHA to play.
You said earlier it should be a check, and theoretically it should be a check. Do you feel like it's not being a check on the other branches of government right now?
It's certainly not in effect to the extent that the law requires. Hawaiians are getting something from that land. For example, there are revenues that are generated that state departments report on, like the Department of Harbors, and a portion of that revenue goes to a fund that goes to Native Hawaiians. But there's a real problem. There's no inventory. The state itself and its departments just don't know how much land should be accounted for, or what revenues pertain to it, and so forth. This absence of an inventory makes it very difficult to enforce. And so this has been a point of contention between the Office of Hawaiian Affairs and the state for many years.
Since we're already talking about it, I did want to ask about the ceded land revenues. Why is it so hard to get an accurate inventory of all of those lands?
It's probably because the will of the government agencies involved is just not there. That could be because they're busy doing other things, or it could be in our government there's not a commitment to follow through on that. So I don't know why. I just know the fact that it's not the case that an inventory has been taken. And without that inventory, it's going to be very difficult to make claims for revenues and for land.
How do we get an accurate inventory of those lands?
One way would be for our legislature and governor to take that responsibility, kuleana, on themselves and to say, we're going to follow through with what the law says and we'll do it. That would be an ideal way. Another way would be for OHA to get involved in some legal action. For example, to go to court and to sue for that, to bring in the federal government. And so it may be the case that as trustees continue to deal with this issue, that they need to take more drastic steps in order to get any results.
I think that's more where I was like thinking, because I mean, this has been an issue for more than 18 years. You're saying that you want to see the legislature and the governor step up and do it. They haven't in the last 18 years. Do you think that OHA is just going to have to take care of that issue itself?
It's OHA's fiduciary duty to see that the Native Hawaiian people get what they deserve. People may be a little surprised to hear me say that, because I don't believe that we as Native Hawaiians are better than anyone else, or more privileged and more deserving of the benefits of living in Hawaii. But from the point of view of justice, at a time when I wasn't really at the table and wasn't here, the law was set up to say that Native Hawaiians are entitled to revenues from the lands that once belonged to the Hawaiian Kingdom for the purpose of their fundamental conditions, their well-being and the fundamental conditions. And that's the law. This is the world I inherited. And rather than see that this law continue to be ignored, I'd like to see that the needs of Hawaiians get met through that.
Recently, well, within the last year or 2 years, the legislature bumped up the annual payments for ceded land revenues to OHA a little bit while they work out what the final amount should be. A lot of that money has gone to increasing grant disbursements every year. There's a view by some that OHA's sort of become a very large grant writing agency. You know, obviously there's a lot more that OHA does besides that. But in terms of the new monies coming in from the ceded land revenues, what do you think OHA could be doing with that money outside of increasing the grant disbursements?
Well, earlier you pointed out that OHA can talk about housing or talk about the fundamental needs of Hawaiians, medical care and so forth, but OHA's not an agency, that it's not a service agency. So the only way that OHA can actually see that those needs of Hawaiians are met is to finance them. It's to provide those funds to competent organizations that are going to take care of the Hawaiian people. And so being a grant writing agency isn't a negative thing at all. It's a glorious thing, because all that is saying is that money is going to go from the Public Lands Trust and eventually get to meeting the needs of Native Hawaiians. And OHA is in the middle of that. And so I don't see a problem with conceiving of OHA as being a very big grant writing fulfilling organization. Now, at the same time, OHA does other things as well. But before I go into that, let me mention one thing that's not really well understood. Every year, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs goes to the state legislature, and it asks for a certain amount of money. Typically, this is seen by a lot of people as OHA seeking its budget from the state legislature. That's not the case at all. OHA's true budget doesn't come from the legislature. OHA has made investments and has a trust and a portfolio of land and stock, and that's where OHA's budget comes from. That's where I don't know where it's at exactly now, but maybe $55 to $70 million a year, including salaries of trustees and so forth. That's not from taxpayers. That's not from the state. That's from OHA's ownership of assets and so forth. When OHA does go to the legislature, it's to carry out a partnership in which the legislature, which owes money to its citizens and wants to use some of that money for Native Hawaiians, engages OHA, and OHA takes that money and sees that it's given out in grants, but OHA actually pays for that whole process. OHA doesn't take any overhead, for example. OHA empowers the state legislature, meaning the people of Hawaii, in order to actually help fulfill their obligation to the Hawaiian people and meet their needs. And the state doesn't even have to pay OHA to do that, because OHA is glad to do that. Now, in addition to providing funding that will meet the needs of Hawaiians, OHA provides a very important sense of identity to Native Hawaiians, and also for all people in the state of Hawaii, acts as a custodian to preserve the culture of Hawaii, as well as give leadership to Malama the Aina, take care of the land, take care of the sea. And this is a very important role that it also plays. OHA also helps to represent Hawaii to the rest of the world in relationships with other Polynesian and Pacific Ocean nations. Recently we had FESPAC over here, in which nations came from all over the world in order to connect with Hawaii. And OHA provided leadership to that. And so this is part of, there are many things that OHA can do beyond merely dispersing grants.
Do you think that OHA is making a big enough of an impact through its current grant program, through the monies it's giving out?
That's a good question. I've seen a lot of evolution in the grant program. When I came into OHA back in 2012, one of the reasons I ran for office is because there were many things that were just not right in the grant program. There were financial matters that were simply out of sync with the state's procurement policy. And there was, just frankly, a great deal of fraud, waste, and abuse in the organization and in the grants program. I'm really very grateful to the people who rallied together and to the trustees who set out to resolve that problem. And so after some forensic reviews and audits and so forth, the fraud, waste, and abuse was exposed. And since that time, the recommendations of auditors have been implemented. So OHA's a different place night and day. The grant system during that period of time was dysfunctional to some extent. It did a lot of good, but it had problems. Let me give you one. The grants team would receive applications and award grants to qualified groups and so forth, and then they would come to the board for approval, final approval of the grants, and at the board level, board members would intervene. And if in some cases, if a group that a board member was connected to didn't get what they wanted, the board member would somehow exert pressure so that they did, and so forth. That's what happened at the first grants approval meeting I attended. I was stunned. The staff had done a great job of identifying groups that deserved grants, and then when it got to the table of the board confronted the staff, the board exerted its power, and ultimately the staff made changes. We've come a long way since then. The grant system now is so disciplined that it's a little tough to get a grant from OHA. Not because OHA doesn't want to give the money, but because it's very strict for the sake of being good stewards. I think we're learning to be softer in that toughness now, but it's a natural swing of the pendulum in order to correct a problem. So I'm very proud of our grants program. I'm very proud of the fact that when I travel to the different islands, I can see Native Hawaiian charter schools and children who are being educated in a way that their culture, their parents play a bigger role than they would in the Department of Education. I see the Native Hawaiian medical system and the role that OHA plays. I see injustices corrected by law firms that OHA helps to fund and so forth. Poverty alleviation taking place as people are able to get the jobs and the homes that they need. We have a tremendous loan program that helps Hawaiians who would not qualify for loans in other institutions to be able to get loans for their businesses, for their homes, for emergencies and so forth, and to get back on their feet. OHA was able to be there, and I was privileged to be part of this. Immediately after the crisis of the burning down of Lahaina, we were able to come in with financial assistance and have been able to grow that since then. So I'd say I'm very pleased with what I've seen happen with the grants program, but in a complete answer to your question, there's more that can be done. And the biggest part of doing more is getting more resources, which would happen when we are able to get a larger portion of the deserved public lands trust revenues.
What's changed, like in the grant process and in the approval process, to make sure that the trustees can't do what you were just describing and exert influence and twist arms to, get what they want and get the organizations that they like what they want?
Great question. Policy is first what has changed. OHA completely revamped. Let's see, I came on board in 2016. 2017, I think we began the work toward the independent audits. 2020, completion of that, around there. The implementation then of the new policy. So first of all, very clear guidelines and policies that assured processes like checks and balances, that no individual trustees could get involved and put their fingers into the process. And in addition to that, discipline. New people were hired in OHA, and they put a system into place. It's important to note also that ongoing accountability, measures to ensure that were put into place. And so the things that were lacking before are there.
Still, one more thing on the money. the Board of Trustees recently, and it might have already adopted this, but you folks were looking at changes to your investment policy, specifically how you approach the investment managers, I think. Could you go over what some of those changes were and how would they affect the investment portfolio?
We're right in the midst now of upgrading our investment policy. And it's not because we're not in the problem we were in before of lack of accountability and fraud, waste, and abuse. We're dealing now, after having put a basic framework for accountability in place, we're dealing now with the question, how do we best serve the Hawaiian people? And how do we, in serving them, maximize the financial investments that we have? And so we're looking at updating financial policies ranging from where to allocate investments in terms of stocks, what kinds of investments, what is an optimal distribution of investment money in different kinds of investments, including real estate, commercial real estate, publicly traded stocks, private stocks, and so forth. All of these things are part of a policy of investment. And we answer questions like, what is the ultimate purpose? And who are we going to serve with this? And we answer questions like, how do we make it accountable to the people? So this work is going on now with advisors. And today, in fact, we had a draft of the latest proposal for an updated policy statement. It's a good thing. Every institution that's going to maximize their investments has to have a good policy statement. And that's exactly what OHA is working on right now. Now, you mentioned one thing in particular. I don't know if for this audience we want to dive in this deeply, but you're talking about portfolio managers. And I don't want to get too technical, but we are moving from a manager of managers structure to a consolidated structure where the board oversees a small leadership group that make decisions that have a bearing on all of the investments. So we're moving from hiring consultants, good managers who work separately from each other because they're actually different companies and so forth, to a more centralized structure. One benefit is you pay less in terms of fees. Another benefit is you don't have contradictory directions being followed. You're able to bring your whole portfolio along with the value decisions you make or with changes in the economy. It's kind of a technical thing. I just mention it because part of the work of the trustees is to be engaged in financial oversight. And so we go through a huge amount of training, including the hiring of a trainer for the trustees to take us through all the rudiments of investment, because we oversee a $600 million stock portfolio. We have commercial lands on top of that, and this is part of the kuleana of the trustees.
It sounds like the trustees would have a greater oversight role under this new structure. Is that correct?
Yes. the policies are being designed so that the trustees fulfill their fiduciary duty of caretaking and overseeing what takes place. But we balance that against the fact that trustees are not financial professionals. And so we need to hire the best financial professionals to actually execute the daily operations.
I did want to move on to a different topic. This is on iwi kupuna. How would you go about addressing the chronic vacancies in the island burial councils? You know, that's been a issue for a number of years.
Appoint people. And the government needs to make sure that these seats are filled. Because if you don't have people there to be the watchdogs, caretakers, the ones who manage the kuleana of our iwi kupuna, there is no there's no way that we're going to be able to fulfill that responsibility. A lot of things that government should be doing doesn't happen because the right people are not appointed to various commissions or roles that need to be filled. Then whether we're talking about Mauna Kea management, whether we're talking about iwi kupuna, whether we're talking about the salary commission to oversee salary changes or at least review at OHA. There are people who are supposed to be in these roles. In some cases, it's the governor who needs to appoint them, and it just hasn't happened, which raises an important question. Why hasn't it happened, and what can be done about it?
Yeah, like, so what role can OHA play in getting the burial councils filled?
This is very important. I want to answer that question by lumping it with some of the other commissions that I mentioned and so forth. OHA needs political clout. If OHA is not respected, OHA is not going to be listened to when it raises a concern. When it goes to the governor and says, you need to appoint someone here, and it's been 8 years and nobody's been appointed to this vacancy. Your administration is failing. That doesn't mean anything to the governor or to the rest of the legislature if OHA doesn't have the respect and gravitas that it needs to have, which raises the question, why doesn't OHA have that? This is something where we as trustees at OHA have to weigh carefully how we interact with the public, what messages we send, how we conduct our own business, because we create respectability or not.
How do you get OHA political clout?
I think political clout begins with authentic relationship, especially here in Hawaii. I'm going to share something a little sensitive here because I differed with my colleagues on this matter. But during the last legislative session, OHA took a position of attacking the Speaker of the House and other legislators in its quest to get zoning variances in order to build high-rise towers in Kaka'ako, Makai. And the attacks in the form of our news releases and words that were communicated directly basically accused the legislature and Speaker of the House of being racist and saying that they will allow non-Hawaiians to build residential towers in Kaka'ako across the street, like Hughes Development and so forth, but they won't allow Hawaiians. And that's racial discrimination. One trustee called it colonialism. And this really didn't help the process of negotiating with the legislature and being taken seriously. One reason is factually that land that OHA was trying to build high-rises on and was restricted from building high-rises because of the zoning was acquired by OHA in that condition already. It was 5 years before OHA got the land that the state had said no high-rise towers. And the owners of the land weren't Hawaiians. They were Alexander and Baldwin, not a Hawaiian company. And people knew this. The legislators knew this. I had legislators who personally told me that they were there when that happened. And this really reduced the credibility of OHA in their eyes.
I want to come back to Kaka'ako in a second, but I wanted to ask you, that was like 6 months ago. Did you bring up your concerns then when it was happening?
Yes, I did. In fact, you guys published it.
Oh, I should read Civil Beat.
Civil Beat is great because you do pick up frequently on some of the more controversial issues. I don't like to come out publicly in disagreement with my fellow trustees. And in fact, I don't disagree with them on the vast majority of policy and on work that we do together. I love them. They're great people. But once in a while, as an independently elected public servant, I have to be true to a higher calling, and that is to the people who elected me, to my beneficiaries whom I'm appointed with a fiduciary duty to care for. So I needed to come out and say, this is not a good thing. And I took a stand because I want to make sure it ends. Because I want my fellow trustees to succeed. I want us all together to succeed in being able to build Kaka'ako Makai. I want us to use negotiation tactics with the state that will work. And the truth is always better than something that's not true, especially when you're talking about the history of something. And the way we treat people that we are negotiating with, whether it's the Speaker of the House or the governor or whomever, is an important part of being able to build credibility. So to your question earlier, how do you build that kind of respect? I think we have to have relationships that show respect.
The proposals for the zoning variances have stalled in the last few sessions in the legislature. What do you think should be done, on your Hakuone lands going forward?
Well, we've got 30 acres of land across the street from the collection of high-rises on north of Ala Moana Boulevard on the Mauka side. That 30 acres extends from Fisherman's Wharf, where there's farmers market there.
This is the one right on the corner of Ward and Ala Moana?
That's right. And it goes Oceanside all the way to Kaka'ako Waterfront Park. And most of that area in there is like warehouse and parking lot and so forth. That's wonderful prime land at the gateway of the city. And I think that it's a responsibility of OHA to develop it and use the revenues to meet the needs of the Hawaiian people, and also turn the place into something wonderful for everybody in the state. Financially, it would be very rewarding if we can do that. So I'm committed to seeing that process through. You asked how. I'd say as we go back, on one level, let's build the relationship with the legislature, the county council, the business community that we need to. Let's act in such a way that we show aloha and we command respect. Then let's be practical. Let's find parts of that project that intersect with the needs of the broader community and start there. For example, there's a need of the community down there already for recreation, commercial, restaurant, entertainment kind of activity that the residents of the existing condos want to have. That's a point of intersection. It would be a lot easier to get permitting for that type of thing than for something that's a little more remote, like a 400-foot high-rise. Then build a little more. Go incrementally, get the ball rolling. We could develop it into one of those beautiful areas that are at the front of wonderful gateway cities like Sydney, Australia. Everybody knows what the Opera House looks like. It's gorgeous. Or Singapore Harbor. We could transform Honolulu that way. And I'm convinced that as our working relationship with the legislature and governor grows, as our reputation grows, and as the point of intersection of the work we do with the rest of the community grows, people will see the merits of OHA's vision to build maybe 3 or 4 high-rise towers. And it's a lot more conceivable than simply saying we're going after all the tower building right away and need to get the zoning variance. We're going to need to take a long-range look. I'm in my 60s. I'm not intending to be in OHA in my hundreds. Or long before that.
At one of the recent board meetings, the idea of having an LLC that OHA sets up manage those kaka'ako lands came up, and I think I saw most of you trustees just about jump out of your seats at the thought of setting up another LLC. I mean, what do you think? My sense was that was going to get an icy reception from the board. What's your sense of moving forward with that? Is that something you think the board would take up?
One of the consultants for the development of kaka'ako listed an LLC as an option for OHA to consider for structuring itself to be able to develop those lands. And the reason limited liability corporation was mentioned is because OHA, as a state government agency, has a great many rules ranging from sunshine law to open records and so forth, a great many rules that make it hard to do planning for development, because that's a commercial activity. If you're a business and you're going to be building a competitive venture like a high-rise, you can't have the public sitting in on all your board meetings, listening to your proprietary information, how much profit you'll get if you do this, et cetera, and so forth. It just wouldn't work. So that's why an LLC was proposed, because an LLC allows the closing off of that to the public. So that's why it was proposed. Not proposed, but that's why it was listed as a possible option. You got some reaction to that because OHA got into a lot of trouble when it first established LLCs many years ago. It created financial structures that didn't have to abide by the state's ethics law or by the state's information practice law or sunshine law. And a lot of things took place there outside of the view of accountability. And that was the reason that Akina ran for office, because those things led to corruption. And the place in which it had really risen to a fine art of corruption is documented in a book called Broken Trust by Randy Roth and Sam King. Broken Trust showed that the great Bishop estate hid a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse through its practice of LLCs. So when that got suggested, naturally, as you say, you saw the reaction of some of the trustees. It's created an issue that has to be resolved. We have to find a structure that will allow for the flexibility that a business venture requires. But at the same time, we have to be able to fulfill our fiduciary duty of holding OHA accountable to the highest ethical standards and being transparent to the public.
I did also want to ask you about Mauna Ala, the Royal Mausoleum. You know, as you know, there's been an effort by OHA to get management transferred from DLNR to the office. Could you tell us, where are things now with that, you know, with that potential transfer?
Well, they're progressing. I think I want to give credit to OHA's new CEO, Stacey Ferreira, for leading efforts to help move to a resolution there. It was a turf war to some extent. The state government felt it had the right to appoint the new Mauna Ala kumu, or leader, coordinator. The OHA sees that that's a very sacred place to the Hawaiian people and is vested in ensuring that the cultural heritage of this place, which is the graves of our ali'i, is cared for with the highest levels of dignity, protocol, and kuleana. So what was at stake is whether the state was acknowledging the role that OHA plays, which Hawaii Revised Statutes accords to OHA, of leading the Hawaiian people and being their steward.
Do you see that happening? Does it seem like DLNR is going to be willing to transfer?
I think there's going to be a positive resolution. And part of the reason I think I'm optimistic. I don't have a crystal ball. But this is an example where OHA, I think, is attempting to practice a very positive kind of negotiation, interaction with the state. And it's relationship driven. So I'm optimistic. I hope it, and I hope it will work. This is as opposed to OHA attacking the state, suing the state, and so forth. I think the approach right now is on the right track.
The office already manages Kukani Loko, the birthing stones in Wahiawa.
Yes.
Do you think that could sort of be a model for how it approaches Mauna Ala?
Well, at Kukani Loko, if you just to make short a rather long history, various parties came together and talked with each other, amongst which was OHA. And OHA played a role of helping state actors to get what they needed from the area. There were certain water rights issues and so forth that the senator from the area needed. it was a positive interaction, and it's led to respect for OHA's role there. And I think that is a good model. It's a start. It's a lot less complex than Mauna Ala, and certainly less complex than Kakako Makai. But at the heart of it, it's about having good relationships and acting in a way that builds integrity.
Also, another topic I wanted to touch on before we wrap up the discussion is on the Ethics Commission. Do you think OHA should be subject to the State Ethics Commission? Why or why not?
OHA trustees and employees of OHA are all employees of the state of Hawaii. And all employees of the state of Hawaii are subject to the Hawaii State Ethics Commission. This commission sets forth certain ethical standards that prevent corruption, that prevent self-dealing, that ensure, for the sake of the people of Hawaii, that state employees are not crooks, basically. Getting out of that is very problematic. If OHA says, we don't want to be part of the state, we don't want to be overseen by the State Ethics Commission, who is going to oversee OHA? This is a very important way of being able to assure the electorate who vote for OHA trustees, the beneficiaries of OHA, that their leaders are conforming to ethical standards. And recently, OHA trustees voted to instruct their attorneys that OHA is not subject to the State Ethics Commission. There was a strategic reason for doing that, but nonetheless, the fact that they voted that way made it impossible for me to go along with that. So I was the one dissenting vote. I respect what they were trying to do. They're trying to assert the autonomy of OHA. They're trying to negotiate for something that OHA deserves to get from the state. But the means by which they were doing it, to arguing that OHA trustees are not subject to the ethics code, is a very dangerous thing. We have to be accountable.
One last question. What's your thoughts about this idea that, if, say, OHA is not subject to the State Ethics Commission, but there's OHA has its own ethics commission to police employees and trustees. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, let's say you're accused of stealing something or a crime and so forth. And you call as your witness your children and your wife who say, no, my dad, he's innocent. He would never do that. You can't get out of that conflict of interest. If OHA has its own commission, its own group to be accountable to, there's a huge conflict of interest there. And so that's why the state needs to play the role of the independent watchdog for all of the state actors.
Great. Well, we're right at time. Trustee Akina, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciated you coming. And thanks, everyone, for joining us tonight here as well. Grab a musubi on your way out.
Thanks, Blaze.